This is a very hard act to follow by somebody who was actually wearing a true hat as a textile specialist. So I won't show you that many textiles. Nothing we have in the Ukrainian part of Scythian territory is as spectacular, but hopefully there will be some interesting additions and comparisons as well. Clothing and its construction reflect the identity of an individual or a group of peoples more than most other aspects of material culture, since it combines both technological achievements and aesthetic values of the society. And I think Arjan material was a very good illustration of that. In a way, clothes are a language in which individual garments constitute vocabulary. The study of the costume of ancient societies not only helps in reconstructing the appearance of the peoples, but it also opens up numerous aspects of their history. Knowing the vocabulary helps to understand the language. Such study is, however, not an easy task, since for most ancient cultures, very little direct evidence of their clothing has survived in the archaeological record. Textiles and other materials from which garments were made are seldom preserved unless you have special circumstances. Even when they do survive, the corpus of finds is in itself biased, since the vast majority of ancient clothing is found in burials, and usually these are the burials of the elite. The reconstruction of ancient clothing must thus rely heavily on literary, iconographic, and archaeological sources. And in fact, that has been the case with European Scythians. Clothing has been regarded as one of the main iconographic identifying criteria for the Scythians. Already in the 5th century BC, again coming back to our friend Herodotus, he describes the costume of one of the Scythian tribes in his catalogue of the Persian king Xerxes' troops. The Sakai, who are Scythians, had on their tall caps, erect and stiff and tapering to a point. They wore breeches and carried their native bows and daggers and axes withal, which they called sagaris. These were Amirgian Scythians, but were called Sakai, for that is the Persian name for all the Scythians. And in fact, the other written source of information about Scythians, albeit much more limited, is contained in the roughly contemporary Achaemenid Persian inscriptions, which mention 3 groups of Scythians or Sakai, and I believe they've already been mentioned here. One of these groups is specified as the pointed hat Scythians. The name indicates that for the Persians, too, clothing in general and the hat in particular served as an ethnic indicator. Thus, in both Greek and Persian written sources, Scythians are identified by and with their clothing. The information in the texts, however, is very scant and often general, so that any further investigation of Scythian clothing must rely on the other evidence. Greek vase painting constitutes one of the most frequently used sources for the study of ancient clothing. And until quite recently, Western scholarship has focused on Attic vase painting as a primary source of information on the appearance of foreigners. Dress in particular, along with weaponry and less frequently phenotype, has been used as a criterion for identification of Scythians and other barbarian peoples known from contemporary literature. Another source of iconographic material is the Achaemenid Persian, and we've seen these reliefs already in several presentations. The bas-relief of Apadana in Persepolis, the elaborately carved facade of the tomb of Darius at Nakshi Rustam, and the rock relief at Bicetun show Scythians, in some cases labeled as such, again with pointy hats. And we of course added this after the presentation of the first day, the Tatarli paintings, which again clearly distinguish Scythians by giving them pointy hats. In fact, that's the only distinguishing characteristic. Note that all this foreign iconographic evidence is exclusively for male dress. So, of course, the largest and most important body of evidence for the study of Scythian costume comes, not surprisingly, from Scythia itself. This material includes stone sculpture, Tarutic arts, clothing appliques, and of course, we can have a conference just on that. And provides important information not only for male, but also occasionally, at least, also for female Scythian clothing, as you can see on this plaque from Chertomlik on the left-hand side. Gold plaques such as this, found in situ, in fact, have been used extensively in reconstruction of various parts of Scythian clothing, particularly female headdresses. Iconography, however, provides no information about the materials, colors, and techniques used to create Scythian clothing. And these are absolutely fundamental to understand much more important aspects of Scythian culture and surrounding cultures, as well as we again have seen from the previous presentation, because this has to do with agriculture, with natural resources, with technologies going back and forth, and of course with the aesthetic and cultural preferences of particular areas. So such data can only be extracted from the extant garments, such as the spectacular finds that we've seen from Arjan and many other Siberian sites, some of which are in the British Museum exhibition. Unlike the case of the Asian zone of Scythian expansion, where permafrost frequently preserved large quantities of organic materials practically unaltered since the day they were buried, much less is known about the organic components of the dress of the European Scythians, due to poor preservation of organics in this region. Fragments of textiles, so these are some of the reconstructions based on the wonderful book by Natalia Polesmak and Barkova, reconstructions of some of the Scythian garments. Fragments of textiles have been recovered from numerous burials in Ukraine, and although the corpus was reviewed in a fairly recent article in the volume on textiles and textile production in Europe, none of these have been analyzed systematically until now. Many are mineralized, which means they're preserved in contact with iron or bronze artifacts, which means they no longer preserve their original color. And in the sense for the topic of today, where we're looking at the color and dyes and pigments, they are not very useful. In this respect, many of the burials which yielded quivers presented in the previous session are of great interest, since they also preserve textiles, providing an opportunity to recover information not only about raw materials of leather and textiles, but also pigments and dyes used to decorate them, thanks to traces of color still visible on some of the fragments. The most interesting in this respect is the burial 2 in Kurgan 5 at Bulgakova, which not only preserved the most complete quiver, hopefully you recall that, but also in association with a female burial, a textile tool set consisting of a box containing wooden weaving tablets, a spindle, and 3 distaffs, so in a way kind of a weaver's or spinner's set. We have reviewed this unique find elsewhere, and there's a reference at the bottom if you're interested, but we wanted to bring it to your attention as it points towards Scythians valuing textile production sufficiently for the tools to accompany their owners into the afterlife. Of course, this is 4th century BC, so we're quite late, and we can also expect some Hellenic influences here. In fact, the box where material was found has very clearly polychrome painting in Hellenic style. Nevertheless, these interesting transitions of technological valuing are quite curious. This same burial also yielded 2 types of fabric and remains of felt, which were found under the quiver. They were found in multiple layers, suggesting that the fabrics were folded before being deposited in the burial. And one of the fabrics was clearly striped. You can see that on the top. Another burial that produced leather finds, burial 1 of Kurgan 8 at Vadoslavka, also contained textiles. Fabrics, originally in at least 20 layers and some red-purple in color, were found in the corner of the burial chamber. This was disturbed burial, so it's possible that it was moved originally. Note also, and this is something we still have to look into more carefully, but there are numerous insects present in the textile, and of course that tells us a lot about the hygiene, but also the fact that textile must have been in close proximity with the human body, because otherwise insects do not get into the textile. This is probably some sort of mite or louse. This layering, likely resulting from folding, suggests that we're not dealing with the garments that were on the body at the time of the burial, but possibly some sort of burial gift of clothing in its own right, although this is still a hypothesis to be confirmed by further research. And note the still visible reddish color of the fabric. Another use of textiles that we've noted in quite a few of the burials was clearly as, this is just another one, sorry, as containers for, or covers for bronze mirrors. And bronze mirrors, incidentally, are only associated with female graves in this part of Scythia. 4 examples are shown here, some of which we have analyzed already. The others clearly are made of plant fiber. That's shown by the SEM analysis, so we did not analyze them for dyes as they're not likely to contain any. Burial 2 in Kurgan 10 and Kamenka included a bronze mirror with a cover consisting of a thick weft-faced tabby, a fine, sorry, I seem to be running behind with my slides, weft-faced tabby and a fine balanced tabby and a felt. So you can see this is how we get them in the boxes that are basically a jumble of lots of things. Very difficult to understand how they relate to each other, so the best way is really to sort of disentangle and understand at least what we're dealing with technologically. And quickly, just to go back to another one from Krasny Perikop, another bronze mirror that was found in association with 2 types of fabric and a fur. Mirrors associated with textiles have been found also in many other parts of the world, particularly in Egypt, Italy, and Greece, suggesting we may deal with a wider phenomenon of mirror wrapping and their special significance in the burial ritual. But again, this is a topic for another presentation. Not all of these textiles were analyzed for dyes. As I mentioned, fabrics and plant fibers preserved their original white color, and as plant fiber fabrics were practically never dyed due to difficulty binding with the dye substances, they were not included in our investigation. To date, we have analyzed 11 samples from 6 burials. In one case, weft and warp were analyzed separately, and the reason why we couldn't do it in other cases is because the textiles are so badly preserved that we couldn't separate the 2 systems. Where preservation allowed identification, all analyzed fabrics were made of sheep wool. And this is important. We've, believe, already covered a little bit on silk. I've checked, and the earliest silks we have, certainly in Ukrainian region, are dating to the 1st century AD, and they're clearly Chinese in origin. I believe one of the pieces from Olbia is in the collections of the British Museum. The weaves are all tabbies, with one possible example of sprang. So we have no twills whatsoever, which is interesting in comparison to Arjan and also Siberian material as well, but makes sense in terms of European patterns. The most effective method to identify dye components in highly degraded archaeological textiles is liquid chromatography. Dye identification is based on the comparison of absorbance spectra and retention times of the detected dye components with a reference spectra library. Prior to chromatography, the colorants recovered from the fiber samples using acidic extraction. Based on the dye component identification, possible biological plant or animal sources can then be suggested. 8 of the analyzed samples tested proved positive for organic dyes, and 2 types of colorants were detected. Indigoid compounds, isotene and indirubin, were identified in 1 sample, while a variety of anthraquinone compounds were identified in 7 samples. The blue indigoids are indicative of a blue vat dyeing with plant material from either woad, Isatis tinctoria, or plant that is more common in Europe. Although the use of Asian Indigofera or Polygonum species cannot be excluded, as the chemical markers for both plant families are the same, so we're having the same problem as the other analyses. The red anthraquinone compounds are indicative of a modern dye process using the Rubiaceae family, so madder family plants. Alizarin and purpurine are the major dyestuffs. Besides these, small amounts of other compounds were found in some of the samples. And the detected combination is characteristic for the use of roots of the cultivated madder, the Rubia tinctorum plant species. Madder is one of the first organic red dye plants. It is native to the Middle East and eastern parts of the Mediterranean. We are not sure whether it was already cultivated or obtained sort of in a semi-wild state, but it was most certainly available in the area that we are dealing with. The detection of proto-catecholae cacoic acid, or rather traces of, which is a type of tannin, in the brown felt from Kamenka might suggest the presence of tannins of hydrolyzable type. Moreover, all samples except the one dyed with indigoids show chromatographic characteristics suggesting the presence of condensed tannin. Further investigation is required, however, to reveal whether tannins are applied to the textile or derived from the burial conditions in Kazu, from the leather finds in the graves. Both dye sources are in agreement with previously analyzed Siberian finds, and obviously we have now comparison also in Achaemenid, although it's far away and quite a bit earlier, but indigoids were also identified in various textiles of Pazyryk and Akalacha, and alizarin and purpurate were found in, again, various fabrics from Akalacha and Pazyryk, where madder was often used in combination with insect dyes, which is something that we, for the moment, do not have. Now, moving on quickly to the pigments. Quivers and wooden arrow shafts produce traces of bright red and blue colors, and so we thought it might be interesting to figure out what the source of these are. 3 leather fragments and 2 wood fragments were analyzed, with 4 preserving red and 2 preserving blue colors. All of the samples come from 2 quivers found in the same site in Inca. SEM with energy dispersive X-ray detection was used for the identification of elemental composition of substances present in the pigments. The red pigment in all 4 of red samples was identified as cinnabar. The blue pigments were different. Copper oxide in one case and possibly calcium copper silicate in another. Further research will be done on cross-sections of the 2 blue samples to identify the stratigraphic distribution of the detected elements. The second case, the calcium copper silicate, is what is frequently associated with so-called Egyptian blue. And if we indeed can prove that, that would be quite interesting and quite exciting. Cinnabar is naturally occurring mercury sulfide and has been utilized for decorative purposes at least since the Neolithic period, with the earliest documented evidence at Çatalhöyük in Turkey. It has then also been identified at Casa Montero flint mine and burials at La Picotilla and Montevideo in the west, so in Spain, in the Vinča sites in Serbia, and all the way to Yanshao culture in the east, and this is all Neolithic and early Bronze Age. While Carpathians and the Donbas region of Ukraine have current sources of cinnabar, neither location was exploited during the Scythian times, according to geologists we've consulted, which leaves us to suppose that cinnabar came from somewhere further afield. But whether it was the west, and there are known cinnabar mines in the Balkans possibly, but the most famous ones were in Spain, or the east. Analysis of trace elements in our pigments and comparison of them to reference materials from various sources will hopefully permit us to narrow down the possible sources. The use of painted leather is, of course, not surprising. These are our little precious scraps that show you the distribution of the red pigment. We can only imagine how spectacular the quiver looked when it was complete. And depictions of ornaments on what could have been leather, clothing, and even quivers themselves in Torutics frequently show ornaments that clearly indicate that the leather garments would have been decorated in some way, possibly by painting. And of course we have painted leather from Siberian graves, like the spectacular female boots on display upstairs. I am not aware whether the leather here has been analyzed, so I won't comment on that, but certainly the red there looks very similar to our cinnabar. I wouldn't be surprised if that would turn out to be the case. Painted arrow shafts are known from various Scythian burials, including examples preserved at Bulgakova and several other instances that Marina showed earlier. The pigments for some of these have not been analyzed yet, but red color is clearly visible, while the original excavation reports also mention the presence of white, black, and blue paint, none of which are unfortunately visible today, but hopefully the traces are still there to carry out the analysis of the actual pigment. Different color patterns likely marked different arrow types, or indicated the brand effectively. It is highly likely that arrows, at least, were produced by the Scythians themselves, so that adds again to the whole question of who is making these objects and where are they getting the raw materials from. And just as a sort of side note, the practice of decorating arrow shafts continued for a very long time, as demonstrated by these Ottoman period arrows. Other wooden objects could also be painted. Here we only show two examples, atop of the wooden box from Bulgakova, and a drawing of the unfortunately lost sarcophagus from Mariinka. Both clearly bear Hellenic style and were likely produced by Hellenic craftspeople, and maybe even in the Pontic Greek centers. Where and how the pigments for these objects were obtained at this point remains unknown, but obviously adds to the complexity of disentangling local Scythian and Greek traditions in this region. Finally, it should be noted that cinnabar was also used in several wooden objects on display upstairs, at least I gather so from the catalog. The wooden and leather shield from Pazyryk Burial Mound 1, and the tabletops from Burial 2, again at Pazyryk. To conclude, so what can we conclude from the preliminary study of dyes and pigments used by Scythians on the territory of modern Ukraine? The most obvious aspect is the prevalence of reds among dyes and pigments. This undoubtedly has at least partially something to do with the cultural preferences. The love for color red is well documented among many ancient cultures, and particularly among the various Scythic populations, and we could have a conference just on that, so I won't go into it. Another factor, however, could also be the preferential survival of red dyes and pigments. Recent experiments by Maya Ringord and Anna Meten-Puselius-Sharp on textile degradation have demonstrated, for example, that textiles dyed with madder tend to retain color and survive better than non-dyed textiles or fabrics colored with other dyes. This may be due to the chemical bonds between the anthraquinone dye molecules and the fibers, and the research on that is continuing. But that may explain the prevalence of red dye textiles, not only here, but for example, I work a lot in Italy, and there we have the same situation. We have more red than anything else, and I find it hard to believe that red was so prevalent. The case may be similar with the pigments. Excavation reports of Bulgakova, as I noted, mention that the arrow shafts initially preserved different colors, and only red is visible, possibly because it retains better. And cinnabar is, of course, known to be a particularly stable pigment, as proven by its survival for many millennia at sites like Çatalhöyük. To date, we have no insect dyes among any of our dye samples, which is a bit surprising given that the prevalence of their use among the Siberian materials. After all, our sites are geographically probably closer to the sources of kermes, which is known in the Eastern Mediterranean, possibly even in the Black Sea area. The reason may be the difference in status. We're dealing mostly with fairly average Scythian burials here, so possibly analysis of remains in some of the richer tombs may yield different results. As in the case with Arjan, there is much more further work to carry out, starting with a systematic census of all textile and leather fragments found in Scythian burials of Ukraine and the analysis, as well as investigation of other colored objects, and of course the collection of reference materials, particularly for cinnabar, in order to try and tackle the important question of its provenance. Thank you very much.
Sveta, do you want to come back up as well, and then we've got time to take a couple of questions.
Thank you both for really enlightening papers. As many people here know, the reliefs at Persepolis were originally painted, And a lot of color has been fugitive. What remains mostly is red and black. And the red is cinnabar. And raw cinnabar has been found at Suso as well, so certainly.
Yeah, I think that connects, and of course it would be nice to have actual chemical analyses and start making kind of a large-scale database of all cinnabar, so we can also try to track the sources, because the sources are not that numerous.
Oh, well then you should, I could put you in touch with people at Harvard, the lab there.
Good, thank you.
The samples of dyed cloths from Arzan I and from the tombs in eastern Pakistan of the same period show that the Arzan I fabrics are very much worse condition and the colors are very much more faded than the objects in the tombs in eastern Turkestan, where the materials are in better condition and the colors are far, far brighter. The later tombs, the Scythian finds that have just been shown, are also in much worse condition, though there's later in period. What is the explanation for this difference in state, not just of preservation of the textile, but in vivacity of the color?
I can take this one. It has to do with actual environmental conditions, because all the textiles from Turkestan come from desert conditions. Aridity is particularly good, and especially presence of salt, which is the case in that area, will preserve colors extremely well. So we have, for example, a situation even in Europe, in Hallstatt salt mines, where textile fragments preserve in perfect conditions and preserve all their colors. Whereas I think Arjan is somewhere between the Turkestan preservation conditions, which are probably as perfect as it gets when it comes to textile, and the Ukrainian examples, which really, the fact that they survive is really a miracle. Most likely it has to do with waterlogging and acidity of the soils. In many cases it's the presence of copper in the vicinity that has bacteria or microbiome. It kills off microorganisms. So that helps preserving textile frequently, and that's the explanation for their survival. But in Arjan, I don't know to what extent the permafrost conditions affect that area or not, because in Pazyryk that is the factor, the freezing. I don't know in Arjan what.
There is no permafrost, of course, any frost in Arjan, and in fact it's just luck that these textiles, they have been preserved. I can't answer the question why, in fact, they have been preserved, because it's such a rare case, but in Arjan too, as we know, some textiles are also survived, so it's another big happiness for us. But in fact, there are some certain conditions that could be evident for the preservation. It's not a very deep pit which was concealed, for example, and there were no oxygen admission. It wasn't so dry condition as in Eastern Turkestan, and even so dry as in Nablakti, say, and there is no frost, so it's just some combination of factors. But I'm not sure that we can say for sure what was it and why was it. Just to say that it's our big luck that they preserved.
Both speakers mentioned mother as the red dye, and one side is Arjan I, which is dated to the period which is much earlier than the Silk Road, let's say. So in practical terms, how would you comment in the middle of Central Asia to get mother, which is Mediterranean shrub, effectively? How can you deliver Mediterranean plant to Central Asia before Silk Road?
In fact, there is no connection and no need of Silk Road in this case, because, for example, according to recent studies in Eastern Turkestan, in the Tarim Basin, for example, Rubia tinctorum could grow in the first millennium BC. They analyzed, they make palynology and other biological studies, and they revealed that the climate was quite suitable for growing matter of that type. So it's quite local for that region, not for Tuva, not for Altai region, but at least for the Tarim Basin.
Not mistaken, the so-called North Cemetery in the Tarim Basin, don't know exact name of the site, but there are tombs that are about 2000 BC. It's all natural wool except certain elements that are dyed in red, and if I remember correctly, they're dyed with madder.
I have about 1,000 questions, but I'll pick 2. I'll pick 1. Oh gosh, which one? So in your chemical analyses, especially of the reds involving the madder, was there any evidence of what mordant was used? And lacking that evidence, can you speculate as to how the actual pots in which the fabrics might have been dyed, be it bronze or copper or tin, how those might have affected or contributed to the depth and permanence of the color? Good one, huh?
I can say that we don't have any evidence that our stuff is so degraded that to recover anything is a miracle. So we cannot really take it to that depth. But I think in Arjan is a different situation.
So in Arjan, all these elements, aluminium, tin, and copper, and iron. With iron, it's more difficult. They are all available in all these chemical analyses, so in all these graphics. But there is a problem that all these metals, they could be just in soil. So we can't determine whether they are from mordant or they are from soil, which contacted the textiles during so many years. So we just so far reject that. I mean, we took it apart, aside, and so we didn't look at that problem.
Okay, I think we're going to have